Hello, I'm Sravish. This is Trust Talks. And today I have with me Ken Leeser, who is a CISO to many startups all over the US, who's got amazing experiences working with SMBs and large companies, and who, in my opinion, is the most demanding and supportive CISO I've ever worked with. Ken, thank you so much for being on Trust Talks today.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's quite the introduction. I appreciate that very much.
Ken, to kick things off, let's talk about something that you and I discussed at length, and I know you have really strong opinions about. What do you think about a SOC 2 attestation? Should we be able to trust it, or is it not worth the paper it's printed on?
It needs to be worth the paper it's printed on. Companies spend a lot of money um, organizing their controls, training their employees, evaluating their systems, and then hiring auditors to come in and validate that those controls are in fact in place. But the third-party risk managers, who are the audience for the SOC 2 report, in my opinion, don't accept them at the same level that other kinds of audited reports, like financial audit reports, are accepted. So we've built this third-party risk complex that somehow needs to go beyond the SOC 2 report for further assurance, which I think that is either a flaw in the way the SOC 2 is constructed, the way auditors are trusted, or simply a make work kind of thing for internal auditors to say that they've done certain levels of due diligence.
One of the pieces of feedback I've heard about SOC 2 attestations and SOC 2 audits is that the people that are doing the audits are not trained cybersecurity or privacy professionals. They're not former operators. They're not practitioners. Do you think that has something to do with it, where the risk team somehow feels that SOC 2 is not as comprehensive because the auditors are not trained to the level that perhaps they need them to be trained?
I think personally it's more about the kinds of controls that need to be looked at and how those get evaluated. Whether you run regular phishing exploits or make sure you have annual training or your policies get updated annually, uh, that's easily evaluated by somebody without a great deal of technical experience. Similarly, is there a report of a backup and restore test, incident response test? These are all sort of very high level things that are easily checked off. But if you really want to look at the quality of a penetration test that was performed and what the remediations were and how it was responded to and tests around that, then perhaps that's the question. But the details of those are not really considered in the SOC 2. It's really, have you done an annual penetration report, and was it performed by somebody who's qualified to do it?
I love that, and I love how you framed the statement in the early part of this conversation, which is, if an auditor has completed an audit and created a SOC 2 attestation, just like a financial auditor would look at your financials and do a financial audit, then why aren't we accepting that as the statement of trust that this company can be trusted? But at the same time, if I'm trying to buy a company or I'm trying to invest in a company, and even if the company has audited financials, what I'm typically doing is asking for the audited financial report, but I'm also asking for all of the information that were provided to those auditors to complete that audit. So perhaps what we need to be doing is not asking for responses to a security questionnaire, but what we should be asking for is, provide me with the same evidence that you provided the auditor so that I can do an independent inspection. And that might be a better way to move forward. What do you think?
Well, I wouldn't raise the level of contracting with a SaaS company to the same necessary level of due diligence that might be required if you're spending tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to buy a company. So if I have a platform that is going to help your business be more productive, produce results on a license basis that's cheaper, faster, and has more actionable data than you could do yourself with your own team, what are the trust points that I have to worry about when I want to do business with that company? And or basically what I want to do is make sure that the confidential information that you will now have access to is not breached or given to somebody who's not authorized to have it. And, the real problem we have here is that every company that's had a breach has been fully compliant with all of the whatever standard you want, whether it's SOC 2 or ISO 27001 or what have you. So, where are we in terms of protecting data and not having my information breached if, in fact, you've submitted a quality SOC 2 report? So, how do we get to the point where breaches don't happen, and how do I prove that? And, maybe it's really not necessarily about examinations, but about contractual liability, right? I don't necessarily, in this case, if we know that the breach is going to happen regardless, I want to be protected in a way that if you're at fault, I get properly compensated for it.
I like that. So maybe a way to disrupt the TPRA industry and the TPRM industry is to essentially go from, if you've got an independent auditor who's created an audit or an attestation of your security and privacy posture, then just skip the third-party risk assessment and instead present the company with a set of contractual commitments and clauses that mimic the commitments that they're claiming to do in their SOC 2 report, and say, you have these controls, so contractually commit and give me liability protection if there's a breach.
Right, and make sure you have enough coverage in your cyber liability policy to do it. And I think we also need to hold the insurance industry accountable to make sure that they're doing the due diligence on the people that they're insuring. And I think they're just performing certain actuarial calculations based on the universe of companies that they insure and the likelihood that N% of them are going to get breached at some point. So I don't really care that your controls are good, bad, or indifferent. I'll have you fill out my questionnaire too. So I'll expect that so many of my clients are going to get breached. I have to pay this much across the year. So my premiums across that same population have to be this amount to cover myself. But that doesn't help you if my company gets breached, except for the financial recuperation that you might be able to get from us. And, I think that there are a number of cases where, the insurance companies have tried to sidestep their obligations because their clients haven't met their obligations. But we need to hold the insurance companies more accountable in that regard as well.
Yep. Well said. As a CISO helping SMB businesses and startups, Ken, when you are in a sales process, which is a large enterprise, even though you have a SOC 2 attestation or an ISO 27001 certification and so on, what do you think, what are best practices that are important for you and the company to share with these enterprises as part of the sales process to ensure that the security review goes as smoothly as possible?
My preference, and this is not always feasible, is to have a conversation, to make the prospect comfortable that the company they're dealing with has a competent person who oversees the information security program. And while there may be imperfections, that they know that there's a certified person helming the ship that has the experience, that understands their needs, that understands what they're doing, that is communicating well within the organization to do that. And that's not always possible. But to me, the one-to-one connection goes far beyond any kind of third-party questionnaire that can be checked off and may even be filled out by some sort of analyst or even automated, or through some sort of RFP software that just has some canned answers here that gets them off the plate and keeps the sales moving. So it's really an assessment of the competence of the people at the top and the commitment of management to the organization, that people create a culture of security awareness that'll protect the data.
Ken, I think that's a great point. Why don't people on their corporate websites have a section that talks about those exact two things? One being, here's the commitment of management around security and privacy, and here's what we're doing, and here's the governance that we have around this. And then number two, here's the competence of the people in charge who are helming the ship. Because we all know everyone's going to get breached at some point or the other. But what you need to know is to trust that if and when that happens, here's the group of people that's going to take care of it. I don't see that very often.
Yeah, to follow on that, Sravish, I try to spend a lot of time on incident response tabletop testing. And a number of organizations I've worked with, I involve some of the bigger clients in it as well. So we're not just sitting in a conference room or a Zoom call and projecting what we would have to do if we get some sort of alert. But, if you want to extend our conversation into areas like GDPR, which is critical if you have a failure of reporting, of reaching, who is your ICO in Europe that you have to report to, and how are you going to do that? And what is the client's responsibility? And what is you as the data processor's responsibility in terms of the reporting and openness and sunlight on the issues that might have arisen here? So, let's focus on, all right, if there is a breach, how do I know that you're going to respond appropriately and responsibly to the issue here and limit the blast radius?
What are some funny questions or weird questions you've been asked while working with large enterprises when they're evaluating your security and privacy posture?
Oh, one of my latest pet peeves is, that they haven't kept up with some of the technology changes. So ideas around, what your password complexity is. Are you changing passwords every 90 days and making sure they have upper and lower and symbols and numbers, et cetera? And that's just been proven to be inadequate protection of passwords these days. Long passphrases that don't require regular changes unless there's been a proven compromise is one of the things that bugs me. And is that the questionnaires themselves haven't been kept up to date. Or the other thing is you get a lot of questions around physical networks. And so many of the SaaS companies aren't operating anything around physical networks anymore. There aren't any domain controllers. There aren't any DMZs on site between the internet and the office network. The majority of SaaS companies are really operating totally in the cloud, virtually, with hosted Exchange or Google Workplace or what have you. And there are no networks anymore, and people are virtually spread out across the country, across the globe to do their work. So, there's just things around old technology and not understanding the business of the organization they're doing business with. And that's another reason to speak directly so it can understand what the ecosystem is the infrastructure that the company is using. Is it modern? Is it protected? Is it patched? And that's more critical to understanding who you're doing business with. If you're getting back to your analogy, Sravish, around due diligence during acquisition, I think the first piece of it is do you trust the person that who runs the business you want to acquire? Is there a relationship there? And do you think they've built a quality company? Not to say there haven't been people who've been duped or think they're getting a good deal and they're not going to look at it. But personal relationships and looking people in the eye, I think, are as important as the piece of paper that says you did your certain level of diligence.
What's your advice, Ken, when you're brought in to advise a startup or help a startup with their security and privacy posture? What are some things that you try to get them to buy into in the first 30 and 60 days that set things up for success?
I find that the most important thing is to understand your onboarding and offboarding processes, especially offboarding. In today's world, the most critical thing is identity and access management. And when you bring people on, it's granting them access, but also, again, inculcating them with the corporate culture around data security and their obligations around confidentiality, and creating a culture of security and situational awareness, so they know what they're doing and when they're doing it. And over time, especially people been there a few years, you've accumulated a portfolio of applications to which you've been given access, you've been granted access. And how do you unravel that when somebody leaves? So to me, to answer your question about the first thing, is really understanding your HR processes and making sure that you have the ability to only grant access to things that people need, that your roles that are established fit the job and the absolute need for people to have access to the data or systems they've been requested for, that you run regular reviews of that access, and that you have ways to roll them off systems cleanly and completely as fast as possible when their time with the company comes to an end.
That's a very non-intuitive statement. I would not have guessed, and it makes sense the way you described it, that one of the first things you should do when you go and talk to a company about their security and privacy program is tell me what you do when you hire somebody, tell me what you do when somebody leaves, and then tell me how you're creating a culture of confidentiality within your organization. And like that gives me the prism of how important you take these things. And if HR is not a partner, that's a problem.
Yeah. I mean, you can, it's not the technology, it's the people, right? It's breaching people. It's, is where all the failure always happens. I mean, maybe not always, but, I guess you could argue that many of the technical vulnerabilities are failures of patching, which also comes back to some failure of the human chain not doing a job that they were supposed to do. And my experience in helping companies achieve compliance is that the technical components are generally there, right? People understand certain rules around passwords and ingress and egress rules or load balancers and firewalls and doing vulnerability scanning, all of those things. I mean, so there's some organization involved here. It's, coming into the closet and hanging things up and putting them in the right slots, et cetera. But the pieces are there. It's really organizing them to present them to an auditor or to prospects. But it's around what people are doing and making sure that they're focused on their jobs, doing them properly, and report things that they see that aren't being done in a way that they think protects the data of the company, the IP, or of their customers.
And Ken, a big part of what you said is that to maintain a really strong security, privacy, and compliance posture is about people. Who are people that inspire you in your journey as a CISO? Who have been trust champions, custodians of trust in their organizations that has pushed you to not only learn and expand your skill set, but also inspired you on how they do it and made you think that I should do it at their level? Who are your trust champions?
Um, I work today for a company called Encore here in Boston, and our CEO, Bob Suh, is a real thought leader. We develop AI algorithms in support of the largest asset managers around the world. And a topic we haven't touched on yet, Sravish, which is really going to explode here very soon, is the whole area of AI algorithm compliance. And, people think about data security around the confidentiality aspect of things, but the three-legged stool of cybersecurity are confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So availability being disaster recovery and things of that nature. Integrity focuses on whether the company is producing accurate results based on the inputs. So if I have a team of developers producing code and my client is reliant on the output of that code to make decisions, and there are ways that the bad actors or bad performers can produce bad code. That really falls under the purview of the CISO. So now we're entering into this arena of machine learning and algorithms where the box in the middle is becoming a lot more magic. And we're relying on machines to transform the inputs to the outputs and the tools that do that. So Bob is really trying to take a very proactive step in regards of looking at the machine learning and algorithms that we produce at Encore without any necessarily prodding from prospects or customers, but that it is an ethical obligation in his mind that we can attest to our customers that, in fact, we have looked at our algorithms and to the best of our ability can say that they produce accurate results. And I will say that in the area of machine learning and that regard, you don't get the 100% results from a simple computer program where you always want 2 + 2 = 4. There is going to be some level of tolerance. And you have this iteration that goes on in algorithms and machine. That's what machine learning means, right? It gets better and better. So producing what those tolerances are, looking at the performance and reporting on that. And he's been very, very assertive and communicative within our organization that this is very important.
And Bob is one of those individuals who's been a stalwart in the Boston entrepreneur scene for many, many years. I think he was one of the first people I actually met when I moved to Boston 15 years ago. So you and I should talk about Bob when we go offline.
We could have a whole other podcast on that if you want.
Yeah. Ken, last question. What's your advice for an entrepreneur who is starting off building a company, who's achieved early product market fit, and who's starting to sell their product to enterprise customers? What is your advice for them to get ready for the security and privacy reviews as part of their sales process?
I think to have a good platform. When I started out in the business 10 years ago, there was no common controls framework. There was no compliance platform out there that allowed companies to cross-reference controls across different standards. So I would recommend getting a platform that allows for the organization of the controls that you already have in place. So the analogy I used earlier about the messy closet, we have all the controls there, but nobody's ever organized them. So to have a platform that allows you to put things in the right slot, whether it's a drawer or hanging up or the upper shelf, making sure things are properly organized so that they're easy to find when somebody asks a question or when the auditors come in. And then making sure you have a strong HR department that can support the things we talked about earlier, which are inculcating people in the corporate philosophy when they get hired, that they have obligations while they work for us, and we have good disciplinary procedures if they violate our goals and our sentiments, and that we offboard them in a timely fashion and remind them of their confidentiality obligations after their time with us.
I think trust is a word we use in business a lot, Ken. And to summarize what you said, your advice is to entrepreneurs should build a system of record for trust and a culture for trust. And that means there's clarity on what your expectations are from every employee. And there's consequences of doing the right thing and not doing the right thing, and making it clear what those consequences are and living and breathing that every day.
Exactly right.
Ken, thank you so much for joining me on this edition of Trust Talks. It was really great talking to you.
Thank you, Sravish.